I thought the anti-fascist argument is very compelling. Had Ukraine not blown up, it was still compelling. Many of the participants have been saying how there are very extremist movements in places like Hungary, in Greece. There are less extreme, but nonetheless worrisome movements in places like Sweden. You have Aalborg in Norway. No one uses his full name, simply the initials. That was an extraordinary act of murder, systematic murder. So fascism or neo-fascism or crypto-fascism or ultra-nationalism or extremism or terrorism bordering on fascism has kind of appeared in so many different places in Europe. And so I thought that, that this was an excellent initiative to talk about where we stand and what we should do with the rise of neo-fascism, and it's not limited to Ukraine. Well, I guess you have to go to an antecedent cause. Why are people becoming extremist? And in the European context, I think it's because the European Union has once again stumbled into a democracy deficit. And the views of people, especially in Brussels, the European Commission, and the various summits of the European Council, seem to be very insulated meetings. And maybe the European Parliament is a little bit more aware of what European publics are thinking of. But I think that really is one of the causes, is the Euroscepticism is feeding an anti-establishment mood. And it may take an extreme form like neo-fascism, but there is definitely an anti-establishment, anti-political elites mood in most European countries. So that's, I think, one of the antecedent causes, one of the sources. It doesn't have to end up as neo-fascism, but there are many other types of ideologies that you can adopt and embrace to justify your opposition to an undemocratic Europe, a remote Europe. But neo-fascism is especially, I think, important for those people who are not necessarily well informed, and there's a lot of anomie in their lives. And then maybe what's really unique about this generation is how few job prospects they have. This is a terrible job market for young kids. And so why not go to some extreme? One extreme is moving in with your parents. There's an extraordinary high rate of children living with their parents, children who are in their 20s and 30s, whether it's in England or the United States or several other countries in Europe for which I have statistics. And this is their way of getting away from an economic crisis, a poor job market. But then there are those who will just become politicized and want to lash out. And I think fascism offers that kind of lashing out opportunity to them. I think there's a bit of ethnic or nationalist entrepreneurship that takes place. So some political elites make a political career on taking advantage of young people's frustrations. I think Spain is a really good example of a place where you have the same phenomenon, very high rate of unemployment among young people, but there was this movement called the Indignados, the outraged. Rage is a positive factor, and they're more on the left, and they really want to take control of their lives. And do it in a within the framework of liberal norms and peaceful protest. The Indignados, it sounds like a group of people who endorse rage are going to go on a rampage, but in fact they don't. And that's maybe what happens in the Mediterranean, that gets a lot of criticism for its for its approach to life, to the slow movement, do everything slowly, eat slowly, work slowly, etc. But one of the positive sides of that is that you're a soft person. So I think that's an excellent point that you make about the distinction between reacting in certain contexts and not in others. And as I say, elites are important, and I think there's just a much more enlightened leadership of frustrated people in Spain than there is in some of the other countries in Europe, including in Northern Europe. Well, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of academic interest in the subject of European decline, European declinism. And it's not there as much in the year 2014 as it was there at the height of the financial crisis. But I still think there's something inevitable about the balance of economic power, in particular shifting over to East Asia. I wrote an article a couple of years ago for a Swedish journal that I titled The End of Immigration to Europe by 1,000 Cuts. And it was mostly focused on bureaucrats in Europe deciding if no one else is going to stop unregulated immigration into Europe, we, bureaucrats, will. We will serve the nation. We are the repository of the values of our nation. They take it upon themselves in the way that the military has always claimed to be doing when there are military coups and so on. But I think after 30 pages, one of my last sentences was something, in any case, so many people will be preferring to emigrate to East Asia than to Europe, including Europeans themselves. So I think there's something inevitable about the shift to East Asia as a kind of an economic juggernaut, and Europe will just have to be philosophical about it. No, it's not an illusion, but that my idea is that in 15 to 20 years' time, if Europe does become Fortress Europe, these people will start heading to overland, I suppose, to East Asia. To the various Gulf states, for example, where there is already huge amounts of foreign labor, and so it's not going to be as pressing a problem for Europe. Of course, so long as Europe can't control its own borders, and so long as the standard of living is so poor in most of Africa, then we will have this pressure in places like Melilla and Ceuta, in Morocco, which are Spanish cities. There will be continued pressure to try to make it any way they can into the Schengen zone. Europe's problems. I've talked about xenophobia in both Western and Eastern Europe. I've talked about the cultural cleavages in Northern Europe compared to Mediterranean Europe. I've written about these subjects. But at a certain point, it's important to admit that if there was no European Union, if there were no other European structures, including for human rights, that expand well beyond Schengen, then it would be much, much worse. So it's easy to be critical about the European Union and some of its other parallel structures. But I think without the European Union, it would be a much more dangerous place. So I'm not a pessimist about this. I think there just has to be less phobia within Europe of each other. I talk about three types of fears in Europe. This is what I've researched. It's not about Canada. It's not about the United States. Those are huge immigration countries, but I don't follow them as well as I do Europe. There are three types I've identified of phobias in a European country. One is of your own minorities, with the Roma at the top of the list. A second type of phobia is of immigrants, immigrant-based diversity, which is what these populist right-wing parties are feeding off of. There's a third type of phobia, and that is of your neighboring nation. That, as they say in Europe, in almost every European country. Europe ends on our eastern border. I remember reading a particular book which said, well, what really is unique about Europe? It's not European values. European values are really universal values that have developed all over the world. But what's really unique about Europe is its ill-defined eastern border. And that, in a sense, even explains the Ukrainian crisis, an ill-defined eastern border. Some of the discourse that was engaged in by Western European leaders really assumed that if Europe associated itself with the European Union, the eastern border of Europe would be on the Ukrainian-Russian border. So you're still talking about borders, and the eastern border of Europe remains a very debatable and conflictual in certain circumstances. And there are three schools of nationalism. One is called instrumentalism, that you have someone like Slobodan Milosevic who creates nationalism and constructs an identity for his own political purposes. Then there is the third school, which is constructivism, that in the words of the Indonesian specialist Benedict Anderson, we have an imagined community. So it doesn't necessarily even serve any political purposes. It's just worth people deciding they imagine themselves to be a community. But I still think primordialism as an explanation for why we are rooted to some places and not to others has a lot to do with it. This is a period when we're told that we can negotiate our identities, whatever it may be, whether it's cultural, it's religious, it's sexual orientation. It can be any one of a number of different things, and we can simply negotiate what we want to look like. And I disagree with that. Being from Canada, being brought up in French Canada, going to French schools, going to English schools, I don't think, as easy as it may be linguistically to cross borders, I don't think you necessarily are going to be sensing belonging to a different community. It's kind of hard to cast off your original primordial identity. And I'm not even talking about genetic issues. Racial is the type of racial identity that we will never ever be able to cast off. Although I guess a lot of Creoles have been able to do it. I live in New Orleans, and it's the ultimate Creole city. So I'd love to have all of us, all of humanity, become Creolized, métissage. But I don't think that's what people in this global world necessarily want as their end product. Well, about St. Petersburg, it's an extraordinary city. I was trained as a political scientist, though I do a lot of cultural studies. I look at literary representations, for example, of immigration, the theater and stories of migration. But as a political scientist, what is interesting is to talk about the various types of power a country can use to gain influence. Generally it's divided into hard and soft power, hard power being military and economic at the most general level, and soft power being diplomatic and cultural. However, it's possible to disaggregate those two categories. And so in terms of the soft power, I like this idea of a sticky power, which is really culture. And if you ask me, what does that mean? I'll say St. Petersburg. I thought the Sochi Olympics opening ceremony really did a terrific job of selling Russia, branding Russia for its largely highbrow culture. And you're not going to get Crimea with such kind of sticky power. Maybe that's good. But I think Russia is very well advised to use sticky power, the cultural appeal of a place like St. Peter's as much as it can. It's going to win so many converts. It happened in the past, and there's no reason why it shouldn't happen in the future, with people really falling in love with Russia's culture, if not necessarily sometimes with their politics.